Welcome to the 3Haunted podcast, where we bring you all things horror, supernatural, folklore, mythology, and all things that go bump in the night.
What's up, everybody? This is your co-host, Ashley Lunar Goddess, Gorilla Girl filmmaker and horror-loving cinephile. I'm just your average podcast-producing badass.
I'm John Thomas. Some would say that I go a little too far with my love of all things horror, paranormal, and meta, but I say, talk nerdy to me, and I'm all yours.
What's up, ghouls, gals, and all of our meta pals out there? In today's episode, we'll be joined by therapist, spiritual director, and fellow podcaster Ben Stimpson. We'll also be discussing his book, Ancestral Veneration Practices, and so much more. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, for having me on. I'm really excited for this.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on. I know John's going to ask, how'd you find Ben? So
Pretty much.
I'm just going to preempt the question. And I actually was fortunate enough. I put a podcast guest request out there on the Book of Faces, and Ben responded, hey, I've got some specialties you might be interested in. And he's not wrong. After looking at his page and everything, like the information he sent me, I'm like, you're right, Ben. I am interested.
It's finding those really niche connections, right? There's somebody out there for everything. Just have to put it out there, right?
Yes. And I will admit, the first time I ever put that post out there, because I've done it a few times over the past 4 years, first time I put it out there, I was a little intimidated because, most of the posts out there, I need a self-help coach. I need a life coach. Is someone able to come guest on that? And here I am with, I would like a metaphysical guest who talks about paranormal and supernatural.
I would like an exorcist to come on, or somebody who speak about aliens. Yeah.
All right. Are you a witch? We want you.
Yes.
So it's just, it was a little, I didn't think the first time I ever posted that I was going to get any responses. And now that I've done it a few times over the past few years, I'm like, hey, people still respond. That's great.
Yeah.
So for you, a big portion of what you and I connected with was your book, as well as this idea of ancestral veneration. Am I saying that correctly?
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Now, what is ancestral veneration?
Absolutely. So it's one of those things where, depending upon your culture that you come from, it's going to mean different things. If I were to write my book and say ancestor worship, that's going to not go really down in English language kind of scenes, right? So ancestor veneration is, really, to put finely, what they're doing in the movie Coco. They're remembering the family. They're creating a space in the family home for those dead family members to return, to celebrate, to be still within that community. So it's in essence, it's a ritual relationship with the dead. It's very different from mourning, which is remembering the dead, which is, remembering the loss and grieving the loss. Grief can come into it, but it steps into the realm of having a relationship with the dead now. So veneration practice is highly ritualized. It's a little bit different from, say, going and, having like a paranormal experience or going on a ghost hunt or something like that. It's about bringing the family home or engaging with the family. So most cultures around the world actually have veneration practices. If you go to any kind of Chinatown or Chinese restaurant, oftentimes you'll see the ancestor shrine just behind the till. If you go to any really Chicano community, you'll often find, especially during Dia de los Muertos, the ofrenda, the family altar with all of the family members on there. And even in Catholic countries in Europe, you still see this of going into the graveyard during the early days of November and decorating the grave, giving food offerings to the dead, engaging with the dead now as opposed to just your memory. So it's a little different, but if you look around the world, most cultures outside of the West has some sort of an ancestor veneration practice. I hope that was a good answer. I'm not sure.
No, absolutely. And I love that you brought Coco into it because I feel like, one, I love that. I identify with that specific culture. But also, I love that because a lot of people didn't understand that concept until that movie came out.
Mhm.
It really kind of helped it become a little bit more
Yeah.
mainstream about, like you were saying, what exactly ancestral veneration is. We're not once a year sitting around this altar to our ancestors just crying and melting down. It's more of a celebration of who they were, who they are, and what they mean to us. So I appreciate that you brought that comparison in. Now, with that said, why is ancestral veneration important?
Mhm.
Like for you, what you wrote a book about
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
What does it serve?
So that kind of ties into my life story. So I'm originally from the United Kingdom. I was born and raised in North Wales, and I came over to Canada. I reside about 2.5 hours outside of Toronto, and for me, I didn't have any connection with my greater, broader family because we came over here when I was so young. So all of the grave sites, the important places of our history, everything was lost because I didn't have a chance to really go and visit. We never really went back to the UK. In the 29 years I've lived over here, I've only gone back once. That was for an extended stay. But it was one of those, I didn't have connection with my family. So how I connected with my family was through story and through remembrance and through I'm sorry, my dog's in the background barking her head off.
It's okay. We get animal appearances during this all the time. We've had cats, dogs. It's fine.
I
It's
love
part
it.
of
I
it.
love it. I love it. So for me, ancestor work was really just ancestor remembering, and then I started to go down a spiritual pathway. So in my teens, I started to explore Wicca and paganism. Started looking at non-Christian forms of religion because as a gay kid in the middle of the country, I didn't feel like I was welcome at any of the churches around me. And then I started to really open up and explore kind of the mediumship and the psychic piece. When my parents bought a 150-year-old huge stone building, and it was haunted. Our house back home was haunted, right? So I always was very connected in with spirits in that way. Like I had all sorts of interesting encounters, and what that taught me was that there was no issue with working with spirits. The spirits that were living in or existing, I should say, in the building that my parents had their business were the original founders of that business. They owned a small brewery, and the building itself was an original stone brewery building. So the spirits that were in that place were the original founders, and they loved the feeling I always got was that they loved that their building had been turned back into a brewery after 100 years of being vacant. So I was really connected in with spirit. Kind of skip ahead 15 years, I started to explore kind of other alternative forms of religion, and I fell in with a Lukumi or Santeria community up here in Canada. And one of the big things in Santeria Lukumi, being an African-based religion, is ancestor work. And at that point in my life, I needed a great deal of healing. I really needed a lot of connection because I was really kind of all over the place. So one of the pathways into working with the orishas, the spirits of that tradition, is ancestor work. Which includes divination, which includes ritual practice, and I started to see my life start to change. So really the book was a culmination of about 5 years of solid work with reacquainting myself with the ancestors through a ritual practice, which was actually a form of communication. So it was it was powerful, and that also coincided with my psychotherapy training. And as a therapist, I could see that the changes that were happening in me because I was also going to therapy at the same time. And then after that, I wrote a book. So pandemic hit, everything was dying around us, and so I was like, yeah, I'm going to write this book.
So first of all, I would like to say I didn't know Santorini had such a big presence in Canada.
It doesn't.
especially African Santorini.
Well, so the community up here, Haitian voodoo tends to have a much bigger presence, but there are quite a few diaspora traditions. A lot of it's filtering in from the States. So my godfather at the time, his community was in Michigan, which had links with Hialeah down in Florida. A lot of people who are kind of in Ontario too, they have links with New York, the Bronx, a lot of the Elays over there. So it's starting to filter up.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I see. That makes sense.
Yeah. Are you connected with it yourself?
No, it's just we've heard more and more and more about it. And so, yeah, no, that's not something that I'm connected with, but I'd like to learn more about. And so, did you find with your journey, because like you said, you started kind of in the witchcraft and then you kind of evolved. Was it for you, they all kind of, as you went along your journey, pieces of it fit together and started to make sense? Or was it more of like yeah, that doesn't work for me and that doesn't work for me process?
No, I think definitely the former. A lot of those pieces flow into each other. They don't blend, but they fit into different parts of my life. So, while I was learning the rituals and learning how kind of very specific ritual practices and offering practices of Lukumi fit in with the ancestors of that tradition. My ancestors were kind of in the back, kind of being very polite about it all, but not sure really how they fit in, right? Because the ritual, and I talk about the importance of ritual in the book, when you're working with spirits, especially spirits who were once humans, they still have that connection with human culture. And so if you look at like the Day of the Dead offrendas, all of the symbols, all of the elements, all of the offerings on those offrendas are culturally specific in a way that is going to be culturally relevant and understandable to the dead that also celebrated that when they were living. So for me, part of my practice was to develop a practice that would connect in with my British ancestors. So I offer them tea because tea is such a culturally relevant thing in the past 200 years for my ancestors. I offer them family recipes. So if I'm offering food as sustenance, I would create food that I knew that my most recent ancestors would have eaten, right? So it becomes a way of connecting through that. Plus, eating it myself, I'm also, engaging with like the sensory experience that they also experience. So a lot of pieces flew together. I don't think that parts of my journey necessarily it was, that doesn't work for me anymore. It was more of a kind of breaking up, but still being affable. Yeah.
An amicable breakup. I got it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
When you create offerings for your ancestors, like in your specific practice, like you're preparing tea or food from family recipes, is this something that you do like throughout the year, and do you set it out prepared? Or I guess, what does that look like, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah,
I know that's
absolutely.
personal.
Absolutely. No, well, I talk about it in the book, so it's not that personal anymore.
Wonderful.
The book being, of course, Ancestral Whispers. So this is the thing. This is my huge piece around ownership of spirituality is owning it for yourself, right? So it's becoming intentional with it. I don't care what you do, as long as you can be intentional about it. So for me, kind of how I was taught to work with the ancestors is that it's not just particular times of the year, because that comes to worldview. The ancestors for me are accessible all the time because, the biological ancestors are in my DNA, are in my blood. My affinity ancestors are part of the society that I live in, right? And there's a difference there. So when I put down offerings, I do it when I think it's appropriate. Like if I make a meal at home, I'll give them a small bite of it because that's a way of honoring the fact that this is like I'm able to make this meal now because of those biological ancestors. If I'm buying like KFC or Chick-fil-A or whatever, like I'm not going to, give them a drumstick, right? But it's throughout the year because they're accessible throughout the year. There are some traditions that will teach that only certain times of the year are appropriate because of cosmological forces, this and all the other, right? And that's okay. It's, again, becoming intentional with that. If you are part of a tradition that teaches that, then it's part of the broader culture, in which case, who was it who said this to me? somebody said to me that, if you come from a tradition where the ancestors are only expected at certain times of the year, like the Day of the Dead, and you try to put an ofrenda in the middle of July, the ancestors won't be there because they're like, well, no, we're coming, we're you're not on the list right now, right?
That's not our time.
It's not our time, yeah. So no, I'm like, I'm enjoying myself. I'll see you in December, in November.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's essentially seeing the ancestors and seeing the dead. And I'm sure you all, from all of your previous guests, seeing these spirits as sentient beings and not just as things or not just as objects, right? I mean, I know like there's differences between like kind of like psychic impressions and then spirit beings, but spirit beings, like acknowledging that they are still existing beings with agency and relating to them like that. That's what veneration is. Mourning is about only seeing them as, dead things that are gone and are never going to return.
I had a question, and this I'm really glad that we have you on because I had a dream. I've already told Ashley and John about this dream, but it's very, very, um, it's perfect for what we're talking about. So on the Day of the Dead, I had this dream where I was I was in the Walking Dead universe, right? Like I even ran into like Rick Grimes in the dream.
Love it.
Yeah, it was weird. And then I was looking for somebody. I couldn't find him, or I did find him, and then for some reason I had to sacrifice myself. And I was laying down, and I couldn't tell you what kind of people these were. All I could tell you is it was from an ancient culture, and they were putting like ceramic plates on me with different symbols on them. And then I had this feeling of warmth and like basically um like a dying, like basically it felt like dying, but it wasn't a scary, it was more of like a goodbye. And then in the dream I started it switches to me crawling up the cliffside and reaching out to the top, and Muhammad Ali reaching out and pulling me up top. And it was like heaven. It was just it wasn't like a mental thing. It was very much a spiritual and like emotional thing that I was feeling up there. It was just pure joy and love and happiness. And so that was really cool. And then they gave me a message. They're like, be kind. If people don't know how to do that, teach them. And which I thought was kind of weird because I mean I guess I'm nice. Sometimes I'm not, like, I wouldn't say like I'm the, like everybody can be a little bit more kind and all that. But um so then I fell back into my body in the dream into the Walking Dead world. And like I like ran to the bathroom, and then I woke up. Like I woke up into my real body, but it took me a minute to figure out like who I was, where I was, and why I wasn't back in that place, or why I wasn't feeling the way I felt when I was in that place. So it was kind of a switch from this spiritual emotional state to this, we live in our minds, right? This mental state in this world and the physical. And it took me a minute. I'm like, oh God, like who am I, where am I? And it was the weirdest feeling in the world because I hadn't felt that before. And so I don't know, like if people that you talk to have, because you talked about, yes, the veneration for like all these different things, but is it also in the dream world?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Dreams are throughout, like, how I wrote this was really a cross-cultural analysis. I never say what people should believe, only that these are the various different forms of this particular topic. And dreams pop up a lot throughout the world. A lot of different traditions see dreams as spirit communication, and we feel it when we know that a dream is just a jumble of things that we've dealt with in the day versus like a message of visitation. And so it sounds for you that it seems like a visitation was happening for you.
Absolutely. It was intense. It was one of the most vivid, intense dreams I've ever had, because you felt like you were somewhere else completely. And I mean, I've had that maybe once or twice in my life for different things, but that was the first time where it kept like jumped to different places and it all connect together. Because usually when I jump to different places, it's chaos, and like you said, it's nothing
Hmm.
that matters really. But this had a
Yeah.
purpose. It felt like, and to have it happen then, which I thought was
Mm.
really really weird and kind of exciting.
Yeah, I love the images too, like Muhammad Ali pulling you up. I love that.
It was weird, yeah, of all people, right? Like, I mean, and that's the thing, I think, and I don't know what it is. Maybe it is ancestral veneration, but just people that represent something in your life. Ashley said this to me when I told her about this. Just like maybe it's a message or a feeling of like strength and all of that, and yeah, like what he represents, or if it was him or what. But it was very very unusual, but in like the best way ever.
Yeah, the way that I saw it was like, there are people, it could be a literal, like, that's literally him. Or to me, I feel like when we're receiving messages, sometimes the messages are sent to us in a way that they're known that we're going to understand it. So it's like, I want to convey this idea to you, so I'm going to send it to you in this way because I
Mm,
know, for example, with him, he represents potentially strength and grace and kindness and all these things
mm,
to BJ. So that's who I'm going to send it in the form of. So he receives all of those
mm.
qualities through that
Yeah.
imagery. But I don't know.
No, I would agree with that. I actually use dream work a lot with my therapy clients. And there's a particular way that I was taught it, and it just so happens to align with how I see it. Like you can find dream journals all over the place, but at the end of the day, those symbols are really meant for us, right? Somebody can look at an apple, and depending on their cultural context, can see 4 different meanings for it. So dream journal is not necessarily going to help you in that. So if Muhammad Ali represents strength and all of those other things for UBGA, then kind of just below the surface of that symbol is where a meaning is. And in truth, I've heard many psychics talk about how they interpret kind of visuals and visions and things in the same way. Teresa Caputo, who I know is a bit of a larger-than-life character, she talked about her own ability in that way. Certain symbols means very specific things for her. And the spirit world knows that, and so they filter through that way of seeing. They cater it to how you're going to understand it, right? I'm not a huge fan of Teresa Caputo, just saying, so I don't lose any street cred. She was fun, but
I had no judgment. Like, we all have inspiration from different sources. So whatever inspires you. I do have a question for you. Now, you are a licensed therapist
Mhm,
as well as a spiritual director. So
mhm,
oftentimes people feel those combat each other, right? Someone who's in the
mhm,
psychological field doesn't quite buy into the paranormal spiritual world in the way that
mhm,
we know it. And so
yeah,
for me, when I see your site where you're offering both directions, therapy and
mhm,
spiritual director,
yeah.
I think that's refreshing. I think that's amazing
Thank
because
you.
it's not divisive. It's saying, hey, it
Mhm.
can all exist together. And I really enjoy that. So, my question then is, what exactly is a spiritual director?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So just for scope of practice reasons, I need to just be very clear that I'm not licensed in Ontario. I am registered in the UK, but I am trained in Ontario with psychotherapy. Because I knew I was moving to the UK, I didn't end up registering here.
Mhm.
I restrict my scope of practice. So I don't tend to work with kind of specific mental illness, or with the language in the legislation is really, really finicky.
Mhm.
Anything that's seriously impacting. So I tend to be very clear. I have a supervisor who can help me understand that piece, though. But that, in a way, freed me up, because the UK, very different way of approaching mental health. The UK is a lot more holistic in their approach, because they understand that the spiritual and the psychological are connected, but they're also separate at the same time, too. How I tend to approach therapy is through Jungian, transpersonal, and a lot more kind of somatic and emotional modalities, which really lends itself to the spiritual direction. what I like to do is differentiate counseling therapy from spiritual direction by saying that therapy is about you and the patterns that you're perpetuating in your life because of trauma, because of how you've been socialized, because of where you're at in your life. Spiritual direction is couples counseling with God or with the divine or with spirit, right? So what it is it's about centering down onto how are you experiencing your relationship with bigger questions, the universe. And it's not my place, although I have my own spirituality, it's not my place to give you that. What I'm using my skills, my therapy skills are in asking you the good questions. Well, when you're experiencing this specific prayer that you're going through or that you're experiencing, how are you experiencing it? How does that shape your relationship with other people in your life, your place in the universe? Like, how are you understanding yourself with that? One of my clients started to talk about kind of their divorce and how then that was affecting their trust and how trusting they were of their spirituality. So that's where the therapy pieces come into it. But we really restrict. I tend to only work with a spiritual direction client maybe twice or once a month. And there's a lot of homework in between. It's really focused on their relationship to spirituality, how they're understanding, versus therapy, which is more about seeking answers from inside. So I hope that sounds wishy-washy, but that's one of the best ways I can say it.
Well, spirituality is a very big
It's
umbrella.
huge.
So to answer that, I'm sure is a little tricky. Now, so I imagine you get clients of all ends of the spectrum, someone who's already in an established faith and someone who's like, I just need to find and connect to something because I feel it within me.
Yeah.
How do you tackle, no, I don't want to say tackle. How do you approach the ones that just don't know where to go? They just know there's something missing.
We start with that seed. We start with that seed of, what are you experiencing? Come into the body. Where does it sit? Right? And then I might give them homework around kind of where that seed has come from. One of my favorite ways in is, tell me about your childhood heroes. Tell me about the characters that you really, really loved or that have really connected with over the years. Right? Could be fictional characters, could be like religious characters, could be your imaginary best friend when you were a kid, right? Whatever it is. And what is it about them? Because oftentimes what we do is, as humans, we're constantly projecting out, right? And as we're beginning to understand ourselves, we recognize things inside ourselves, outside of ourselves first, before we realize what's happening inside. This is why people get really annoyed with people or really love people and then come to realize, oh, well, no, what I'm really appreciating in that person is actually what I really want to appreciate in me, but I can't see it because of that socialization. So we start there, and then that builds. With the question of like, I want to explore my spirituality, but I don't know how, that piece around not knowing how is often where I fit in. I ask for good questions, right? So I talk about like, tell me about a time that you felt connected. Tell me about a time that you felt like there was something bigger than yourself. And we explore that. As soon as people start to explore that and have that space that I can create to explore that, then everything's coming out. I can give them language to use. And that's the other key piece. When we have language to use and terms to use or even images to use, oftentimes that we can really focus in on that. So something I did once was somebody was experiencing, kept getting dreams actually of a figure that seemed bigger than life for them. And it was a deity. They kept thinking it was a deity. And so I said, well, draw this deity. Draw this figure, experience that. And so she just started drawing, made multiple images of this thing that was coming to them, and then started to realize that it was actually one of the saints that she grew up with when she was very young, right? But it was her relationship with that saint that was coming through. So it really is, it's sticking with where the person is at, and then allowing them to guide me while I'm guiding them, if that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense.
I'm sorry. It's so funny when you do something and then somebody asks like, "What do you do?" It's almost like teaching a language. It's like, oh, yeah. Well, you just do it, right?
Like, well, and that's you make a very good point. We have guests that come on and they talk about, connect to your ancestors. You need to connect to your spirit guide team, or connect to, a goddess or a god or a deity. And it sounds very simple. Like, oh yeah, okay, I just have to do that. But
Just
then
do
you
it.
pause and think about it. You're like, how?
Yeah.
How do I connect to my spirit guide team? How do I connect to? And so I guess to your point, like when someone's already done it, it's a little bit more intuitive, I think, to be like, well, this is what you do. But for the people that haven't done it yet, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
I just need to do that. Wait a minute. How do I do that?
But this is where it becomes really a tricky piece for me. And so one of the biggest criticism of this book is that I don't give people rituals to do. I don't give people a way to follow. And that was really intentional. And I try to be very intentional with that with my spiritual work with people. Because as soon as you give somebody something like a ritual, there's always a chance that they will just take it and it will just be script. And they won't take ownership of it because they think then this is how I need to do it, instead of it flowing from the inside out. The relationship is stunted because I've given you a prayer to say. Well, that prayer might make no sense to you. You might not have any connection with it. But if you're hyper focused on that prayer, or on that ritual, or on that thing to do, then there's always, again, that chance that the focus then will be on this as opposed to the relationship that you have. So for me, it was very important that I not give anybody a cookie cutter tradition to follow. To go and explore that for yourself, to bring and create those connections for yourself. Because when you own something and learn something, you embody it. As opposed to when you just memorize something and can just, spout it off with no emotional connection, right?
Does it matter like what tools that you can use? I mean, I feel like when you're connecting with spirits, there's a lot of different ways you can connect to them, right? And I'm not sure if this is the same thing, but like trying to have almost like a communication with them. I mean, the first thing that came to my mind is like a Ouija board, right? Like just different ways with connecting, and that might be a dangerous game, right? Like it may not be something that you're connecting to the people that you want to connect to. And is that an issue as well? If you don't have these specific ways for people to connect with their ancestors, maybe they connect with something else.
This is the thing. This is where tradition comes in. I'm a traditionalist. I believe in the power of tradition. Tradition is tied to tested and true. Right? Tradition has, it's like a groove that a river flows through, right? It's tied, tested, and true. When you look at how organic traditions evolve, whether it be religious traditions, whether it be something newer like spiritualism, right, or spiritismo, right? You look at those have been tested by many, many different people. And the things that don't work in that are rejected. So what you're then involved with is a tradition that works. The spirits that are involved with that tradition are known. And within that tradition, there are ways then, like, for example, let's say Haitian voodoo, right, or any of the other ATRs. There are ways that initiated people within those traditions can recognize when a spirit that doesn't belong in a space is not allowed. And so there are ways of removing that very quickly. The other spirits involved often do the same thing. They recognize immediately when somebody is faking a possession, and it's like, no, get the fuck out, right? Or if a spirit tries to take in, right? There's ways. So for me, I feel like we're in a weird time in our human history where we have a lot of people living together in societies that are very young. And like Western society is an amalgam of all sorts of different societies around the world. And a lot of people are not connected with kind of traditions that go back thousands of years or hundreds of years, right? So they're trying to figure out ways themselves. Now, things like Wicca or paganism, right? reclaiming those older traditions, or creating new ones, like in the New Age, right? It's like the first generation after the flood, trying to test all these things out. We have enough literature now, we have enough people teaching about these things, that it becomes then an onus of finding a guide who can help you guide to connect with these spirits in ways that are going to be safe. But if you're just taking out a Ouija board and you don't know what you're doing, there is that danger. You don't know who's on the other end, right? And unfortunately, we see the prevalence of mental illness starting to become really big in these particular traditions and these cultural spheres, because I feel like people are gravitated towards spirituality as a way of bypassing, as a way of transcending or trying to transcend those issues. So, and what happens? You have somebody who's weakened because of mental illness, perhaps, and spirits are going to jump them, right? You have people who have no sense of bearing because they don't have elders ahead of them who are going to be saying, no, what you're experiencing right now is just a projection. That's not the course. So you get cult leaders everywhere who are, making it all about themselves. So I feel like guides are very important, and that's where tradition comes in. It has built within it those systems of mentorship, and the tools, how to use those tools effectively. But I also think that emerging now, we have other guides too. We have people who have experienced and continue to experience using those tools to connect with spirits, who are putting out their tips and tricks and ways to use these tools in a safe way. Also, how to recognize when things are interloping, right? So I think that tools, long story short, I think that tools are very powerful. People need to learn how to use them. Tradition often will teach you that, but you don't necessarily have to be within a tradition. But it's finding those guides and those experienced people who know how to use those tools so that you don't get into dangerous situations.
Yeah, you make a really good point. And I think right now we're in a world where people are craving the tradition to connect to those things, but kind of like weight loss, it's like wanting that fast pill, that quick fix, so going directly to it. Because we see it right now, mushrooms are really common. Ayahuasca is common. Like, it's becoming more and more. And we had a guest come on years ago talking about peyote. And she said, just don't jump into these things willy-nilly, because those people that use peyote, ayahuasca, and all of those things, they have a tradition behind them. They've trained their entire lives to incorporate these things to help them on their spiritual journey. And so just jumping in, like, you may not be prepared for what happens when you just jump in. And I think it's interesting because it's not discrediting the use of any of that. It's just, like you said, finding the guide and finding the practices that help you develop for that so that you're ready for it.
Absolutely. This is a point of ritual. Ritual as story, ritual as experience, has been shown to reshape neural pathways. And that's really what initiation processes are all about. They're experiences that are going to prepare you for encountering or tying in with a current that you normally wouldn't be allowed to within those cultures, right? Fortunately, what happens is you get people who are, again, oftentimes in the West, coming from a place of being wounded, looking for a place of wanting to, to heal that. And then they go and they try to experience it from a very wholesome place. They're coming from a good place, but they might not have the access to go down to these indigenous places and spaces. Right, Sky? Yes, exactly. To go down to these spaces to engage with the actual culture and engage with. And so what do? They look locally. And you don't know if that 30-year-old guy or girl or whoever who is hosting an ayahuasca ceremony necessarily has the training or the license to do it. And you don't know, as soon as she pulls out those singing bowls or he pulls out that shamanic drum from the Sami lands, whether or not that's actually connected with ayahuasca. And you don't know then, right? And I think that's I think it's a huge issue. I was pulled aside by a friend a few weeks ago, somebody who has experienced a lot of ceremony down in South America, and we had a very long discussion about the type of people who have not gained the license and therefore not the understanding, putting together ceremonies with all sorts of elements, right? The typical New Age hippie sort of stereotype, and the damage that they're doing because of that, right?
That one thing I was really curious about is it goes along with this is if there's these people that are not qualified necessarily, do you run into people pushing their tradition, right? Because I feel like there's a bias there, right? So I mean, I feel like I don't know. There are going to be people out there that'll be like, no, this is the way you do it. This is the way you're supposed to do it, and this is where you're going to get the most success out of it. I found in this particular cultural practice and tradition, and you're like, well, that's not really what's in my family, but maybe I'll give it a try. And I feel like there might be some of that going on.
I would say so. I would say so. I mean, I have a lot of opinions on this. Again, if people are listening to this, don't send me letters, don't come for me. But but I do think that these are conversations that are hard because the people who are perpetuating the harm do not want to hear them. And it's one of those things where, like in the ATRs, we have all sorts of people who are claiming that they do not need to be initiated to work with Orishas, with voodoo spirits, with Inkisi and Palo, right? They don't believe that they need to be initiated. And the reason that they don't want to be initiated is the oversight, right? They want to be able to monopolize it and make money from it and really feed their own narcissism. The number of cult leaders who intentionally try to create their own systems because they want followers is huge, and they're everywhere, right? So it's about then, okay, well, what is the actual oversight here? Yes, abuses can happen in traditions, especially when you're not in the indigenous landscapes that these come from, right? If you come from a village in Cuba and everybody is initiated in that village and there are elders upon elders upon elders, they're not just elders in the tradition. They're your grandparents, they're your great uncles, they're, members of society. And if you decide that you're going to go and like scam somebody to make money using these sacred traditions, you're going to have a lot of angry people knocking on your door. In North America, we don't have that because you can be in the middle of like a city and you could be the only one practicing a certain, say, African tradition. And majority of people don't have the cultural nuanced understanding to see that what you're doing is bullshit. So you can just be spouting off. Any criticism of you can easily then say, well, they're just being gatekeepers, or they're being, they're the fake ones. I'm real, I'm true, right? Look at cacao ceremonies. Now, I'm not a big fan of the sacred cacao training ceremonies, mainly because when you look at how they're being presented and put out there in North America, I don't know many people from Mexico and traditional Mexican and Guatemalan cultures that have access to Tibetan sound bowls. And yet how many sound bowls are appearing in these ceremonies, right? It's bullshit. I'm sorry. But any questioning of that, and what do? You get defensiveness because of the role that these ceremonies are playing for people in their lives, which is, I have a hurt that I need to fill. This is what's, this is the Band-Aid. How dare you criticize it, right? So I think I might be veering off into a rant from your question, but
No, it's important. I think that was an important thing to say, because yeah, it's a problem. I mean, it's an Instagram influencer, and they're spreading all of this tradition that's not their own, but they thought it was interesting, right? Like, I feel like there are a lot of adopting things without actually going full on with it, going to discover these traditions. And I think, like, is it important? It's got to be, right? Like, that you find your specific cultural the way to do it. Like, do you find people going outside of their own culture and adopting other types of traditions, or is it?
Yeah, that's where it becomes more nuanced, because I'm obviously a white guy from the UK who's lived in Canada, right? And I'm connected with African traditions. I really draw a lot from Hinduism, for example, right? But I think that there's a difference there, which is going to the community, actually engaging with the community, being given license from that community, right? Initiation in a lot of these traditions is understood that you're joining the band, you're joining the tribe, you're being initiated into that clan, right? Whereas that's different from, watching the movie Coco, thinking, that looks really pretty, and that feels really pretty to me. So I'm going to make a friend of myself completely outside of any cultural contact with that community, right? I feel like it can become a dangerous thing when we start to say things like you should only stick with your own culture. But if you do decide to enter somebody else's home, first of all, you have to be invited. You have to have a relationship with that family. And then maybe that home will become yours, right? With understanding, right? With understanding.
I think a caveat too that you both have kind of hinted at is communication and presentation. Right now, thanks to social media and online certifications left and right of everything, you too can be a shaman for $9.99. The communication's being lost, that because the person, whoever it is presenting themselves as, I am, trained by a Peruvian shaman, so therefore I am. And it's like, no, unless you have really gone in and, completely changed your way of life and attached to that culture, it's really hard to identify as that. I think this is going to sound like a really silly comparison, but for me, it's a lot like martial arts, right? You've got the different disciplines. You've got Taekwondo, you've got karate, you've got all of these things that people train in, and they will spend their whole life on that path and understanding the culture and the tradition and why each piece of that is the way that it is. And then you've got mixed martial arts. It's like, well, I've borrowed a little bit from everything. And so for me, I feel like we're missing that mixed martial arts message when it comes to spirituality of like, you know what, guys, I've been inspired by curandera. I've been inspired by, all of these things, but this is really my own practice. And if you're curious about it, here it is. Where I find the issue is that a lot of people don't speak to that truth. And instead it's like, well, no, I am a Peruvian shaman. And it's like, but are you really?
Exactly, right? Exactly. This is the thing. And it's this weird, again, coming back to worldview, it's this weird Western need for authenticity by applying to ancientness, right? That's a very, I just completed a bachelor's in medieval studies. That is a medieval thing going back centuries, right? That need for that sense of authenticity. There is nothing wrong with innovation. In fact, that's how culture changes and grows and adapts, right? If you look at folklore around the world, you will see motifs that have existed throughout entire continents, but show up individually in each individual region because they were adopted organically. There's nothing wrong with being inspired by. But again, have the, like you were saying, Ashley, right? Have the gumption, have the courage to actually say, no, this is an innovation, right? I'm inspired by this, but this is an innovation. But don't be showing up in the wide-brimmed hats and the wraps and all of that, saying, I'm a Peruvian shaman. Okay, right, Becky, okay. I mean, it's one of those things,
It is Becky.
It is Becky.
All right, Becky.
Becky with an I, right?
Well, and honestly, that's what we see, right? We see someone go spend 2 months in the mountains of Peru because they have the finances to do it, or they go to the Dominican and spend like 2 weeks there, and they come back and they're like, I am certified in this now. And it's like, I don't think you can be certified in what you're claiming, but okay. And that's not to discredit, they feel a connection and they have their journey. But I do oftentimes feel like people also want to feel important. So they're like, I want to be a shaman, or I want to be a priestess, or I want to be a lunar goddess. No, I'm just kidding. I have to tease myself a little. I'm a lunar goddess. But
You are a lunar goddess.
there's this level of I want to be important, but they don't understand there's a responsibility with that title and that importance. There's a responsibility to educate yourself and to continue that education and to respect the culture that's coming from, but also a responsibility to the people that you are now saying, this is what I am.
Yeah. Right. And if you don't have that community, then you don't have that responsibility. Then who are you? We see this in the witchcraft community. I was chatting to in my own podcast, I've been really connecting with a lot of the traditional craft witches. Very particular niche group. These are all the big names in that particular group of authors. And I've always been very interested about this phenomenon. You're seeing this, the witch of Salem, the witch of California, the witch of wherever, right? And I think what people are cluing into is that they want to be the witch of the village. But if they're not in a village that needs a witch, then there's no need for them, right? Some of those places do. And this is where the changing of kind of those traditional roles to bring them into the present day is. But it's interesting that this isn't just a Western, kind of North American phenomena. I was watching a documentary about an initiation of a shaman in Buryatia, which is the area of the oblast of Russia, just north of Mongolia. So really, really connected in with around Lake Baikal, up in that area. And this woman had to be initiated because if she wasn't initiated and gave up this sacrifice to these spirits, she was going to die. The spirits are going to be the only ones who can save her now because she's dealing with some very intense medical stuff. And so the trade-off is she has to devote the rest of her life in order to live. And she does. And she says afterwards, I see all of these people from Moscow and St. Petersburg and all this coming out here to be initiated. And the big thing in Russia right now, the occult and metaphysics is a huge thing over there.
Really?
Huge. After the fall of the Soviet Union, huge big influx of and there's a huge history of interest in the occult. I mean, like Madame Blavatsky, for example, right? Love Madame Blavatsky. But this shaman was saying I wouldn't want my life on anybody because of the amount of sacrifice I had to do. And what she's saying is the same in Lakumi and Voodoo, in all the African traditions that I know of, lots of times in many Native American cultures, exact same thing. The trade-off is we're going to save you, but you're going to have to be our servants now, right? So she said, I don't understand what they think they're getting themselves into because I wouldn't want this on anybody, right? So it's an interesting thing. It's kind of worldwide.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a complete life of service. And I think, as you said, in the Western realm of things, it's not really a life of service. It's a life of prestige and power. I am now the head of this. I am now, I've reached a higher point, and it's just oh, wait, you're forgetting the other half.
Yes.
Actually, not even half. You're forgetting the point.
Yeah. But I think that it is changing. Sorry, BJ, go on.
Just the fact that we're having this conversation, the day that we're living in is crazy. I mean, it's interesting and that's part, I think, a big reason why there's so many issues in the United States is, the lack of culture, a lack of tradition that keeps being passed down. It's all these frauds, right? It's all these people coming in, and it's not necessarily a bad thing because they're trying to connect back to their roots. And I think that there's maybe a growth in that, right? I think people are really trying to find something because those traditional cultures that were, in a specific place, and everybody's part of that culture, and it's passed down in these traditions, and so everybody knows that you don't have to write it down because it's just been passed down. And so having to do the research and having to put your name on it, it's different, and it's a different way of going about it, and it's kind of what we're all kind of dealing with, right? Because where we are, obviously it's going to be 2024, and with the internet and everything else, everybody uses these tools to connect with each other all over, so it's much easier to find out all this information. But like Ashley was saying, you were saying, it's not something that should be taken lightly, and and it sucks because you might be taking advantage of people, and that's never good.
Yeah.
I think the most outrageous thing I've seen I don't know how many of you have been on TikTok, but on TikTok you can do battles with other people, and you basically are battling to see how many of your followers will give you gifts and who gets the most. It's just, to me, it's absurd. But it was 4 people battling each other, and they were all healers.
Right.
And I was like, hold on. One of them had his drums, another one had his flute, and another one, and they were all just talking about like whose version of healing was basically more powerful while they're vying, to win the most gifts. And I'm like, this feels wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this is just sums up kind of where we're at right now, where we've got people, like you said, Ben, it is changing. The world's changing. People are trying to connect to something. It's just, I think it rings on something you said earlier. It's how you're approaching it, what you're coming to it as. So I feel like a lot of people are coming to it really hurting, really, carrying trauma. And so when they go through this journey, even though they've gotten the certification and they've gotten the, clearing, they think, aha, I'm fixed. And it's like, we still have to heal. There's still some more healing in there.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's a really, really deep cultural issue for many, many different communities, not just the spiritual community. We see this in all sorts of communities, and it's that sense of individualism. We need to be individually amazing and fantastic, and really the center of our own worlds, because our culture tells us that. Protestantism tells us that. We have to have our own relationship, very unique and special with God. We can't have anything else in the way, right? When you look at Catholic communities and cultures around the world, collectivist cultures around the world, the idea of a central identity is connected in with community. And so if you're going to be an asshole, your community is going to stop you, because the community is really, they're trying to preserve the community. But in the individualistic West, right, especially I think after the 80s, right, that whole idea of succeed at any expense. You and your personal goals are most important, right? That whole Reaganism thing, right? Greed is good, capitalism is the best, all of this, that, and all the other, right? That filters into the spiritual communities, because how many people, are selling all sorts of services in this, and they have to make themselves branded. I say that while having put out a book and doing many multiple podcasts, right? 10 years ago, I would not have had to be doing the amount of publicity I need to do with this, because there wasn't a huge number of people doing the same thing, right? And that's a part, like, I own that. That's a part of the problem with the spiritual communities right now, is the commodification and capitalism of it all. And what does that feed? A poverty bias, right? The sense of poverty, always being in lack. So when you see people who are always in a sense of lack, what are they going to do? They're going to train in Reiki, they're going to train in cacao ceremony, they're going to become a Peruvian shaman, they're going to do, crystal angel healing modality, they're going to get onto Udemy and just everything. They have to become everything, and in the process, they become nothing, right? Yeah, and I will say I've fallen into this trap as well. I'm not just on a pedestal looking down on people when I say that. I fell into that trap myself a few years ago when I was doing my therapy training. I was like, I need to be everything. So when you went onto my website 4 years ago, I was offering 7 different services because I thought I had to. And then when I finally woke up to that and be like, what am I doing? The ancestors helped me do that, bringing us back to where we started.
I think it's hard. To, yes, the commodification happens and the financial aspect happens, but I kind of get it, because unless you are completely self-serving, this practice and this learning is only for me. A lot of us, as we start to heal, want to help others. It's almost like that natural process of universe, God, whoever, you're healing me, I want to help give back and heal too, that mutual service and exchange, right? But then it's this idea that if I put myself into that, it's going to take time. It's going to take energy. It's going to take effort. So there has to be some kind of trade. Unfortunately, the world we live in right now, trade exists in dollars and, stuff like that. Back in the day, I think if you were a shaman, it wasn't easy at all, but it was easier to be taken care of. Or if you were the town witch, because your community took care of you. They are giving you what you need to live, your food, your shelter, your clothing, because you're providing that service and taking care of your community. It can't exist that way now. And so we do see it in dollars and, or money in exchange for monetary gain. And that's where I think we start to get the people, the ones that are a little harder to, or actually sometimes easier to spot, that are like, I can make money from this? Wonderful. Which makes it hard for the authentic ones that maybe just need to be taken care of by their community too.
Well, that's the thing, and in so doing, what happens is the reservoir of resources and support is filtered away.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a very good example of that piece. Bringing up TikTok, a few months ago, you probably know this one. A few months ago, there was a particular TikToker who invited a load of other influential TikTokers on Witch Talk to put together a Witch Talk grimoire.
Oh.
Now, what happened with this? Did you hear about this?
No, that sounds like a not good idea.
It was not a good idea. No. What happened? So she did this. She put it together. She started selling it on Amazon. And then some of the other pagan authors got a hold of it and saw how much had been plagiarized by these other people on TikTok from books that are from big pagan publishers. So now this person is probably going to be looking at lawsuits from them. And I'm saying like published authors from Llewellyn, Weiser, Inner Traditions, like the top 3 big ones, right? Mm-hmm. And her attitude was like, yeah, she did a live stream where people were calling her out on this, and her excuse was, well, the information should be free anyways.
What?
Where are you coming from? Exactly. It was shocking.
Meanwhile, she charged on Amazon for a book.
Yeah, like $25 or something like that. Right?
That's I think that's part of the problem, right? Like, there's these lack of communities. There's these lack, or at least because you're trusting strangers basically on something that's should be very deeply rooted in your family and culture and all the things. And when you reach out to strangers, there's a disconnect there, and there's a bias there, and there's a lot that could go wrong. And that's, I think, especially in the United States, I feel like that's a big issue. And ever since COVID, it seems like there's been this influx of just everybody wanting to get into these arenas, right? Traditions, spirituality, all of the things
being published, right?
Yeah, so it's hard to. It's a tough thing to jump into, I would say, and maybe you're like what you're saying. The best place to look are these communities deep rooted in their traditions. That's a good place to start, right?
I would say so. I think that if not those communities specifically, being open to awareness of authenticity, right? If again, there's nothing wrong with creating something new. I had somebody on my podcast a few weeks ago who created a whole magical tradition by himself based on earlier traditions, but he's owning this is new. He's taking ownership of it, right? There's nothing wrong with innovation. But I think if you're going to attach your name to ancient communities or traditions, then first of all, you need to be able to back that up. And what often happens is as soon as you ask somebody who is not really connected with tradition that they're claiming to be part of, who are your elders, the block gets hit very quickly, or the defensiveness goes up very quickly, right? And I think that in kind of Western spiritual communities, we have to be a lot more comfortable with asking, well, where was your training, right? There's a particular person, I won't say their name, but there's a particular person who puts themselves out as a Tibetan Lama, and that they went to MIT, and that they were all of these different things, but not that MIT, the one you're thinking of. No, this MIT over in New Zealand. And the Tibetan Lama piece will actually comes from his Reiki training, because there's a thread there, but you have to understand that. All of these like really weaselly sort of things, right? People need to be open to, again, asking those questions of, well, where did you do your training, vetting people, because there are far too many people who are not. And the more open somebody is, usually the more authentic they are, right?
And you do have to be okay
Yeah.
with vetting people, especially because I
Yeah.
think a lot of people, when they're on the journey of feeling lost and trying to find their path,
Mhm.
they forget what's at stake. If you come across the wrong person, it's not just like, well, I tried it out. It's your energy, it's your emotional and
Mhm.
mental well-being. It's all tied together. So like we're putting it up. We're putting it out there to be played with almost. And so it's like, you know what? Vet it out. Vet it.
Yeah, the vetting piece is really important. Like, it's interesting for me because of how I trained and how I put myself out as a therapist. I had to be, again, very cautious about my scope of practice because there was legislation that was really governing my work, and as it should be, right? There needs to be legislation around people who work with mental health. There has to be. I'm looking at the UK, and I'm actively moving over there in the next 9 months or so. They actually aren't regulating psychotherapy and counseling over there. There are particular organizations that are that do the job that the government should be doing. But there are so many people against those organizations because they don't want oversight. They don't want to be saying, like, they don't want to be controlled because they feel like they know it all, right? That's when it becomes dangerous. And some of the people, you can usually tell who is associated with an acclaiming body or a registration body versus somebody who isn't. This, I think, is why we have such a wide array of ethical concerns with the coaching community, right? There are some incredible coaching organizations that are training people. And then there are weekend courses that people go and train in. And you can usually tell ethically when somebody is coming from maybe a weekend course versus a bigger course, right? I was on a podcast once, and at the end of the podcast, the interviewer said, Ben, I feel like I can really help you. Would you like a free course for one of my services? And when I spoke to the admin of one of the big podcasting groups that we're on, she said, absolutely, that's not allowed. And it's unfortunately being taught by some of these organizations. But that is absolutely not allowed because of the power imbalance there, right? It's icky, right? So I feel like oversight wherever we are. But then the question is, who gets to decide what the oversight is, right? That's a bigger conversation.
Now, you've mentioned your podcast. What is your podcast about?
Yeah, for sure. So I started my podcast, it's called Essence Podcast with Ben Stimpson. And originally I started it during the pandemic. And it was a way really for me to connect in with other authors because I was in the process of writing my book then. Really the best thing I ever did, I'll be honest with you. The majority of my guests are pagan or witchcraft authors in the spiritual community somewhere. And they're people that I've respected or have come to respect. I have people like Matt Oren, for example. I don't know if you know Matt Oren's work. No? So Matt Oren is, he was a reader in Salem for 15 years before moving out to the West Coast. Came out with a really hugely successful book on psychic skills, developing psychic skills, 200,000 copies sold. So I've had Matt Oren come on. I've had his partner Devin and Storm come on. A lot of the bigger names in a very niche community, and really it's about connecting with them, not just being like, so you wrote a book, tell us about that. So I just released 53 episodes. The season's over. I'm starting it up again in January, and it really is just me connecting with authors, asking the questions that don't get asked. A lot of times it's about their writing processes. So what was it like for you to connect in with this work? How did you change as you wrote? Because the publishing can take up to 2 years sometimes. My own book was about 2 years to get from start to finish. So you're going to change over that time. So that's what my podcast is all about. Just nice conversational, getting to the essence of things.
And where can people find your podcast?
Of course. So you can go to benstimpson.com, which has a tab on there from my podcast. You can also find it on Spotify, Apple, and all of those, as well as YouTube. So that's where the video component is.
Now, if people want to reach out to you or connect with you directly, are you open to that?
Absolutely. So if they go to my website, benstimpson.com, they can either see my services on there. If they have questions about my book or anything like that, I'm also on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and you can find all of that stuff on the website.
Awesome. Now, did we have any final thoughts before we wrap this amazing episode up?
I just want to say I appreciate your perspective on all of this. It's nice. It's kind of refreshing, right? Like it's not you're not selling a particular tradition. You're just offering it up to people. It's just, to inform them, to be a little bit more open-minded, but also like do your research, right? Because a lot of that's what we need now. We need people to tell us don't just jump into something because it sounds interesting, right? Find the roots. So I think that's great.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You've been amazing, Ben. I love this conversation.
I agree.
I just feel like I'm just ranting all the time on these podcasts, so I appreciate you taking up my ranting.
No way. It's been engaging and interactive, and I love it. Trust me, we've had ranters. You're not one. I would not qualify you as one. Not even close.
Yeah. No.
All right, John Thomas, you want to bring us home?
Thank you again, Ben, for coming on. And I agree, like I said, with everybody, definitely do your research before you jump into anything. It's key. It's important. Do it. And thank you to all of our listeners for listening to this episode of 3Haunted Podcast with your hosts. I'm John Thomas.
I am Ashley Lunar Goddess.
And I'm Vijay Segura.
If you have any questions, comments, or episode suggestions, please feel free to email us at 3hauntedpodcast@gmail.com. And if you haven't done so already, please like, follow, and subscribe to all of our social media. You don't want to miss amazing guests like a Ben.
There's nobody like Ben.
Nobody.
Thank you, Ben.
I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Until next time. Are you looking for more awesome podcasts? Head on over to withoutyourhead.com for access to the Without Your Head podcast network, where you'll find a variety of podcasts sure to keep you entertained and coming back for more.